On the morning of October 14, 1943, Hauptmann Hans Berger stood in a harvested wheat field outside the village of Schweinfurt in central Germany and looked at what had fallen from the sky. He was 31 years old, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot from Munich who had been flying since 1938 and who had accumulated, in 5 years of war over Spain, France, Britain, and now the skies above his own country, more than 400 combat missions and a level of professional confidence that very few men in any air force anywhere in the world had earned the right to carry. He had shot down 23 Allied aircraft. He had been shot down twice himself, once over the English Channel in 1940 and once over northern France in 1942. And he had walked away from both crashes with the particular calm of a man who has made his peace with the specific risks of his profession. He was not a man who was easily impressed by machines. He had flown the Messerschmitt Bf 109, which was among the finest fighter aircraft in the world. He had transitioned to the Focke-Wulf 190, which was better. He understood aircraft the way a surgeon understands anatomy, not just the function of each part, but the relationship between parts. The way a decision made in the design of one system created consequences in 3 others. The way an aircraft was not a collection of components, but an argument made in metal about what flying should be. What was lying in that wheat field was not making an argument he had heard before. The aircraft had come down during what the Americans were already calling Black Thursday, the second Schweinfurt raid, in which the 191 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses of the United States 8th Air Force had flown 600 miles into the heart of Germany to bomb the ball-bearing factories that kept the Wehrmacht's tanks and aircraft and artillery moving. 60 of those B-17s had not come home. It was the highest single-day loss the American strategic bombing campaign would ever suffer. German fighter pilots and anti-aircraft gunners had torn the formation apart over 6 hours of continuous combat across the entire length of Germany, and the fields and forests of Bavaria were littered with the wreckage of what had fallen. Thought Berger had personally shot down 2 B-17s that morning. He knew this aircraft. He had been fighting it for months. He had studied its defensive armament, its formation tactics, its altitude performance, its vulnerability to head-on attack. He knew where to hit it and where not to hit it and what it looked like when it was dying. He thought he understood it. He did not understand what he was looking at in that wheat field. The B-17 had come down relatively intact as bomber crashes went. One wing had separated on impact and lay 100 meters to the north. The tail section had broken off and was embedded in a low stone wall at the field's edge, but the fuselage, from the nose to the waist gunner positions, was largely recognizable, as an aircraft, lying on its right side, had a slight angle, one engine still attached to the left wing root. The cockpit glass cracked, but not entirely gone. Berger walked around the outside first, then he climbed in. He spent 4 hours in that field. By the time he was done, his notebook contained observations that he would later describe. In a post-war interview conducted by the United States Air Force Historical Research Agency in 1952, as the beginning of a re-education, he said that word carefully, not a surprise, not a shock, a re-education, as if what he found inside that aircraft required him not merely to update his understanding, but to rebuild it from different materials. Hold that word, re-education, because it will come back. And when it does, it will carry the weight of everything that Berger saw in that field and everything he understood about what it meant for the war, that both sides were still fighting above the skies of Germany. Of stories like this one. Stories that go beyond the headlines and into the specific human details of what the Second World War actually was, matter to you. Hit subscribe and the like button now. It helps this channel reach the people who want this kind of history. To understand what left Hans Berger speechless inside that downed B-17, you first need to understand what German aviation looked like in October of 1943, not in the triumphant summer of 1940, when the Luftwaffe was the most powerful air force in the world. its pilots were the most experienced combat aviators on Earth in October of 1943. Because the gap between those two moments and what had produced it is the context without which nothing Berger found in that wheat field makes complete sense. The Luftwaffe of 1943 was a force in transition between what it had been and what it was becoming, and what it was becoming was not encouraging. The Battle of Britain had consumed the irreplaceable core of the pre-war pilot cadre, the men who had learned their trade in Spain and Poland and France, and who had brought to the campaign against Britain a level of operational experience that could not be manufactured in a training school. Those men were not all dead, but enough of them were dead that the average experience level of a Luftwaffe fighter pilot in 1943 was significantly lower than it had been in 1940. The training pipeline that was supposed to replace them was under pressure from every direction. Simultaneously, fuel shortages were reducing training flight hours, the demands of multiple fronts, the Eastern Front consuming pilots at a rate that the training schools struggled to match, the Mediterranean theater requiring constant reinforcement, the home defense mission expanding as American and British bombing raids penetrated deeper into Germany, were pulling qualified instructors away from training units and into operational ones. A Luftwaffe fighter pilot arriving at his first operational uni in the autumn of 1943 might have 150 total flight hours, compared to the 300 or more that his predecessors had carried into combat in 1940 against him. In increasing numbers were American pilots who had been trained in a system that Berger, standing in that wheat field in October 1943, did not yet fully understand but was beginning to suspect was different from anything the Luftwaffe had encountered before. The German fighter pilots, or over the Reich in 1943, was a specific kind of exhausting, not the exhaustion of physical danger alone, though that was real enough in the daily scrambles against formations of hundreds of bombers protected by fighters that were getting better every month. It was the exhaustion of mathematics, the mathematics of replacement. Every pilot lost over the Reich was a pilot who had to be replaced from a training pipeline that was producing pilots faster than E4, but not fast enough, and not at the quality level that the operational situation demanded. Every aircraft to Stroh was an aircraft that had to be replaced from factories that were producing more than ever before, but were now being bombed by the same formations that the fighters were trying to stop. General Major Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, had understood this mathematic since at least the spring of 1943, and had been communicating his concerns to Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring in terms that grew progressive. Eli less diplomatic as the year wore on. Galland wanted better aircraft. He wanted the Me-160 jet fighter, which he had flown in prototype form and which he believed could restore German air superiority over the Reich if deployed in sufficient numbers. He wanted more pilots, with more training hours. He wanted a coherent strategy for home defense that prioritized the destruction of the American bomber formations over every other mission. What he got, repeatedly, was Göring's insistence that the Luftwaffe's problems were a failure of will rather than a failure of resources, and a directive to attack the American bombers more aggressively with the aircraft and pilots that existed. This was the institutional context in which Hans Berger climbed into the wreckage of the B-17 in that Bavarian wheat field. He was a skilled, experienced pilot in an air force that was beginning to lose a war of attrition and had not anticipated fighting against an opponent whose industrial capacity he was about to confront in a way that no briefing, no intelligence report, and no combat engagement had prepared him for. He started in the cockpit of the Boeing B-17F, the variant that had been flying the Schweinfurt missions. Was a working environment that no German aircraft designer of the era had produced anything comparable to. Berger understood cockpit design. He had flown aircraft with good cockpits and aircraft with poor ones, and he knew the difference in the specific way that a pilot knows it, which is not through theoretical assessment, but through the physical experience of reaching for an instrument in poor visibility and finding it exactly where his hand expected it to be, or not finding it, or finding something else instead. The B-17 cockpit was large. That was the first thing. It was large in a way that no German fighter cockpit was large, which was unsurprising given that the B-17 was a four-engine heavy bomber and a fighter was a single-engine air craft designed for a single occupant. But the size was not the thing that arrested Berger's attention. The arrangement was. Every instrument, every control, every switch and lever and dial in the B-17 cockpit was where it was for a reason that Berger could identify by looking at it for 30 seconds. The throttle quadrant for all four engines was positioned so that the pilot's left hand could reach it without taking his eyes off the instruments. The instrument panel itself was arranged in what American aviation designers called the basic T: airspeed indicator, attitude indicator, altimeter across the top, turn coordinator and directional gyro, and vertical speed indicator below, a standardized arrangement that had been adopted across the entire American aviation industry so that a pilot transitioning from one aircraft type to another would find the 6 primary instruments in the same relative position in every cockpit he ever occupied. This was not how German cockpits were arranged. German cockpit design in 1943 was still largely an iterative process. Each aircraft type designed by engineers who made their own decisions about instrument placement based on the specific characteristics of that aircraft, producing cockpits that were individually logical but collectively inconsistent. A German pilot transitioning from the Bf-109 to the FW-190 needed time to learn where things were. A German pilot transitioning from either of those to a bomber type needed considerably more time. The instruments were not where his hands expected them to be. The controls were not where his muscle memory had placed them. Berger noted this in his notebook. He noted it briefly, one line, almost as a passing observation. But it was not a passing observation. It was the first piece of a pattern he was beginning to see, and the pattern was this. Every decision in this cockpit had been made with the pilot's workload in mind, not the aircraft's performance, not the engineer's convenience. The pilot's workload. Someone had asked, at every stage of this design, what does the man flying this aircraft need to be able to do without thinking about it? And had then arranged everything so that he could do exactly that. Then Berger found the oxygen system. The oxygen system on the B-17 was not a single piece of equipment. It was a network, a carefully engineered, deliberately redundant network that ran through the entire aircraft from nose to tail, and that Berger, tracing it with his hands in the cold October air coming through the broken fuselage, spent nearly 40 minutes mapping before he understood what he was looking at. Every crew position on the B-17 at its own oxygen outlet, not a shared system with a central supply that crewmen connected to by moving to a specific location, individual outlets, one at each station, so that the bombardier in the nose and the tail gunner 20 meters behind him and every man in between had oxygen available exactly where he worked without moving, without disconnecting and reconnecting, without the vulnerability of a single point failure that would leave multiple crew members without oxygen simultaneously. The system had redundancy built into it at every level. The oxygen bottles were distributed throughout the aircraft rather than concentrated in one location, so that a single hit from flak or a fighter's cannon that destroyed one bottle cluster did not deprive the entire crew. The connecting lines ran through protected routing where the airframe provided some shielding. The outlets at each crew station had individual shut-off valve so that a damaged line at one position could be isolated without affecting the others. Berger had been flying at high altitude for 5 years. He knew what oxygen deprivation did to a man. He knew what it felt like in the early stages, the false warmth, the pleasant confusion, the absolute certainty that everything was fine that arrived precisely as everything was becoming catastrophically not fine. He had seen it happen to other pilots. the aircraft beginning to wander, the responses on the radio becoming slow and strange, the recovery when someone got oxygen to them in time. The silence when no one did. The German approach to oxygen in a multi-crew aircraft was a shared system. It worked when it worked, when it did not work, when a line was cut or a bottle was hit. The consequences spread through the crew in the same way that a single point failure always spreads through a stem that has not been designed to contain it. Berger had never thought about this as a design choice. It was simply how oxygen systems were built. It was how the aircraft he flew and the aircraft he fought against were built. What he was tracing with his hands in that fuselage was a different philosophy, a philosophy that said a crew of 10 men flying 600 miles into enemy territory deserved a system that would continue to keep them alive even after the enemy had done his best to stop it. Not because it was idealistic, because it was practical, because a crew that stayed conscious and functional at 25,000 feet was a crew that could keep the aircraft flying and the guns operating and the bombs on target. And that outcome was worth the additional engineering complexity and the additional weight and the additional cost of building it the right way. Weight mattered on a bomber. Every pound added to the airframe was a pound subtracted from the bomb load or a pound added to the fuel requirement. American aircraft designers at Boeing had made a deliberate choice to carry a weight of a properly redundant oxygen system rather than accept the operational risk of a system that could be defeated by a single hit. That choice had been made in an office in Seattle by engineers who would never fly at 25,000 feet over Schweinfurt, and it had been implemented on an assembly line in the same city by workers who had never heard a cannon shell come through an aluminum fuselage. Berger wrote for pages about the oxygen system, for pages in a notebook that he had begun filling with single-line observations about cockpit layout. The oxygen system was the moment the observations stopped being single lines. Oberstleutnant Egon Mayer was 27 years old in October of 1943 and was already one of the most decorated fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe. He commanded 3 Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader to Richthofen, one of the premier fighter units defending the western approaches to Germany, and he had accumulated 100 aerial victories, a number that placed him among the highest-scoring pilots on the Western Front. He was also the man who had developed the head-on attack against American bomber formations. The tactic of diving through the front of a B-17 formation at closing speeds of over 500 miles per hour to evade the defensive fire from the dorsal turret and the waist gunners that made attacking from the rear so costly. Mayer had killed a great many B-17s with that tactic. He had also studied those aircraft with the professional attention of a man whose survival depended on knowing exactly where the weak points were and exactly where they were. He knew the B-17's defensive armament better than most American gunners knew it. He knew the fields of fire of each gun position, the blind spots, the angles from which a fighter could approach with the least exposure to return fire. He knew the aircraft as a target. What he did not know, and what Berger's notebook was beginning to document, was the aircraft as a system. The difference between those 2 ways of knowing the same machine was the difference between a hunter who knows where the animal is vulnerable and an engineer who understands why the animal is alive. In the first place, in November of 1943, Mayer read a copy of Berger's report that had been circulated through the fighter command. He added his own observations, drawn from the dozens of B-17s he had examined at crash sites and from the detailed technical intelligence reports that the Luftwaffe's evaluation center at Rechlin had produced on captured American aircraft. He forwarded the combined document to Gallen's office with a cover note that said, in translation, that the document described characteristics of American aircraft construction at the Luftwaffe and design and production programs had not yet achieved, and that closing the gap would require decisions at a level above his authority to recommend. Gallen read it. He filed it. He was already fighting too many battles on too many fronts to open another one. The electrical system was what broke Berger's professional composure for the first time. He had been maintaining the detached systematic approach of an engineer conducting an assessment, moving through the aircraft section by section, noting what he found, reserving judgment. The cockpit instruments had impressed him. The oxygen system had impressed him more. The armor protection around the pilot's seat, a combination of steel plate behind the seat back and armored glass in the windscreen, was heavier and more comprehensive than anything on the FW-190, had made him pause and calculate the weight penalty the Americans had accepted to provide it. But the electrical system was something else. The B-17 ran on a 28-volt direct current electrical system that powered, among other things, the gun turrets, the bomb release mechanisms, the radio equipment, the instrument lighting, the heated flight suits that kept the crew alive at temperatures of -40°C at operational altitude, and the engine starter motors. It was a system of considerable complexity serving a wide range of critical functions simultaneously, and it had been designed with a redundancy and a protection architecture that Berger spent 2 hours tracing before he was satisfied he understood it. The wiring was rooted in conduit, not all of it. The aircraft had taken battle damage and some runs were exposed, but the primary runs, the ones serving the critical systems, were protected in metal conduit fastened to the airframe structure. The conduit protected the wiring from the kind of secondary damage that combat experience had shown was one of the most common causes of mission kills. A fragment that missed every vital component but severed an electrical line and took down the turret or the radio or the bomb release at the moment it was needed most. The circuit protection was fused at every branch point, not a single fuse for the entire electrical system, or a handful of fuses for the major circuits, individual fuses at every branch, so that a short circuit in the tail gunner's heated suit circuit did not take down the dorsal turret or the radio. The failure was contained. The system degraded gracefully rather than catastrophically, and the wiring itself. Berger cut a short section of wire from a run had already been severed by battle damage and looked at it carefully. The insulation was a rubber compound he did not immediately recognize, thicker and more flexible than the insulation used on the equivalent German aircraft wiring, and when he bent it repeatedly in the cold air it remained pliable where German aircraft wiring insulation at similar temperatures would have begun to stiffen and crack. This mattered at altitude. It mattered in the cold. It mattered in the specific way that a detail that seems minor in a laboratory becomes critical when the temperature outside the fuselage is -40. And the aircraft has been flying for 4 hours and the wiring has been flexing with every movement of the airframe for every one of those 4 hours. Someone had thought about cold. Someone had specified a wire insulation compound that would remain functional at the temperatures the aircraft would actually encounter in operational use, rather than the temperatures of a comfortable test facility. Someone had done that work before the first aircraft was built, when the decision was still cheap to make, rather than after the first aircraft began losing electrical systems over Germany because the wiring had stiffened and cracked at altitude. Berger wrote in his notebook that the electrical system of the B-17 represented a standard of engineering integration that he had not previously encountered in any aircraft he had examined. He wrote that the redundancy was not incidental but deliberate, not the result of over-engineering, but of a specific design philosophy that treated the failure of individual components as an assumption, to be planned for rather than a possibility to be minimized. He wrote those words in a harvested wheat field in Bavaria in October of 1943, and then he sat back on the cold ground with his notebook in his lap and looked at the aircraft around him for a long time without writing anything, because he had just understood something that the cockpit instruments and the oxygen system and the armor had been pointing toward without quite arriving at. He had understood what kind of country built this aircraft, not what kind of engineers, what kind of country, a country that had decided, before the first rivet was driven, that the 10 men who would fly this aircraft into the most heavily defended airspace in Europe deserved a machine that would keep trying to bring them home even after it had been damaged, even after the enemy had done his best, even after every individual system had taken its hits and been degraded. Not because American engineers were more talented than German ones. He did not believe that, and nothing he had seen suggested it. Because American aircraft design had asked a different question at the beginning. Not how do we build the best possible aircraft under ideal conditions, how do we build an aircraft that continues to function under the worst conditions its crew will actually encounter. The question produced a different aircraft, and the aircraft produced the numbers that were now, in October of 1943, beginning to tell a story at the Luftwaffe's operational commanders did not want to hear. Hold the detail about the wire insulation. Hold it next to a number that Berger did not know when he sat in that field, but that exists in the production records of the Boeing Company and the United States Army Air Forces. And that tells the story of what the aircraft he was examining actually represented. In 1943 alone, American factories built 4,614 B-17 Flying Fortresses, not total production. That single year, 4,614 aircraft, each one built to the same standardized specifications, each one with the same redundant oxygen system and the same protected electrical routing and the same armored pilot's seat and the same flexible wire insulation that stayed pliable at -40 degrees. Germany built 1,184 Focke-Wulf 190s in 1943. The FW-190 was a superb fighter aircraft, arguably the finest single-engine fighter in the world at that point in the war. It was also a fighter, not a bomber. And the comparison of production numbers is not entirely fair for that reason, but the ratio is the point, not the absolute numbers. The ratio. For every German fighter coming off the production line, the Americans were completing nearly 4 heavy bombers, each one carrying a crew of 10, each one capable of delivering 4 tons of bombs to a target 600 miles away. The Luftwaffe could shoot down B-17s. On Black Thursday, October 14, 1943, it had shot down 60 of them in a single day, the greatest single-day loss of the American bombing campaign. But 60 aircraft at 4,614 produced that year was 1.3% of annual production. The Luftwaffe would have needed to sustain that rate of destruction every day of the year to consume American B-17 production faster than it arrived. It had achieved it once, at enormous cost in its own pilots and aircraft, and it could not sustain it. Berger knew none of these specific numbers sitting in that field, but he felt the logic. He had been fighting B-17s for months. He had seen the formations grow larger, not smaller. He had seen new aircraft appear with new equipment, better defensive armament, improved turrets, and modifications that address weaknesses his tactics had been exploiting. He had seen the Americans absorb losses that would have ended a German bomber offensive and return the next week with the same numbers or more. He had understood for some time that the Americans were building aircraft faster than his unit was destroying them. What the wreckage around him was telling him, for the first time with the specificity of an engineer's examination rather than the impression of a combat pilot, was why those aircraft kept coming back even after they had been hit. Why the ones that did not go down kept flying. Why the crews that survived and returned reported that their aircraft had taken cannon fire and shrapnel and had lost engines and hydraulics and oxygen and electrical systems in various combinations and had still, somehow, brought them home. They came home because the aircraft had been designed to bring them home even when it was dying, because the redundancy was real and not theoretical, because the wire insulation stayed flexible at -40 and the oxygen kept flowing from the undamaged bottles and the fuses contained the electrica. Failures and the pilot's armor stopped the fragment that would otherwise have killed him before he could make it back across the channel. Berger closed his notebook. He had been in the field for 4 hours. The afternoon light was going and it was getting colder, and there was nothing more to see that he had not already recorded. He looked at the B-17 one more time before he left, the broken wing lying 100 meters away, the tail section in the stone wall, the fuselage on its side with the October sky visible through the holes in the aluminum skin where his colleague's cannon shell LS had passed through. 10 men had flown this aircraft into the worst air battle of the war. He did not know how many of them had survived. He knew that the aircraft had gone down. He also knew, with the certainty of a man who had just spent 4 hours examining how it was built, that it had not gone down easily, that it had kept flying long after a less carefully engineered machine would have stopped, that somewhere in the gap between when it should have fallen and when it actually fell, some of those 10 men had perhaps found time to get out. He walked back to his car and drove to the airfield. He had a mission briefing in the morning. The report that Hans Berger submitted to his group commander in the days following Black Thursday was not the first technical assessment of a captured or down the American aircraft that the Luftwaffe had produced. The evaluation center at Rechlin, the German equivalent of the American test facility at Wright Field in Ohio, had been examining captured Allied aircraft since the beginning of the war. They had flown a Spitfire, they had flown a Hurricane, they had examined a B-24 Liberator that had come down largely intact in North Africa. They had produced detailed technical reports on the P-47 Thunderbolt after the first examples appear over the Reich in the spring of 1943. Those reports were thorough. They were professional. They assessed performance figures, armament specifications, engine characteristics, and structural limitations with the precision that German engineering culture brought to every technical problem encountered. They told the Luftwaffe's operational commanders what the Allied aircraft could do and what it could not do, and where it was vulnerable and where it was not. What they did not tell them, and what Berger's report was beginning to articulate in a way that the Rechlin assessments had not, was what the Allied aircraft revealed about the country that built it, not its performance envelope, its philosophy, the assumptions buried inside every engineering decision, the questions that had been asked before the first drawing was made, the answers that those questions had produced and that were now flying over Germany in formations of 200 and 300 and eventually 1,000 aircraft at a time. Berger's report reached Gallen's office in November of 1943. It was read, annotated, and filed alongside Mayer's covering note. There is no record of any specific action taken in response to its conclusions. The Luftwaffe was not in a position, by November of 1943, to redesign its aircraft production philosophy on the basis of a single report from a fighter pilot in Bavaria. However acute that report's observations might be, the decisions that would have needed to be made to respond to what Berger had found were decisions about industrial policy and resource allocation and strategic priority that had already been made in other directions and could not be made without consequences that no one in the German command structure was prepared to accept. The report was filed. The war continued. The formations kept coming. In the spring of 1944, the American bombing campaign over Germany entered a new phase, the introduction of the P-51 Mustang as a long-range escort fighter, capable of accompanying the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, removed the one tactical advantage the Luftwaffe had retained through the difficult months of late 1943 until the Mustang arrived. The bombers had been unescorted for the deepest penetrations into Germany, and it was in those unescorted stretches that the German fighters had extracted their heaviest toll. The Mustang closed that window permanently. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing the air war over Germany so completely that Gallen's earlier warnings about unsustainable attrition had become not a prediction, but a description of the present. Fighter pilot losses were exceeding the training pipeline's ability to replace them. The experience level of the average Luftwaffe pilot defending the Reich had fallen to a point where young men were being sent into combat against some of the most experienced fighter pilots in the world with training that the pilots of 1940 would have considered inadequate for a first solo flight. against them. In those P-51s and in the bombers they escorted were American aircrew who had been produced by a training system that Berger had begun to understand in that wheat field in October 1943, and that was, in its own way, as carefully engineered as the oxygen system and the electrical routing and the flexible wire insulation he had examined. The United States Army Air Forces trained its aircrew through a pipeline that began with the classification of every candidate according to aptitude, physical fitness, and specific skill profile, and that assigned each man to the training track: pilot, navigator, bombardier, gunner, radio operator, for which his assessment suggested he was best suited. The pipeline had been designed by psychologists and educators working alongside military aviation professionals, and it incorporated the same standardization principle that ran through every other aspect of the American military system. The training syllabus was identical at every base. The aircraft used for each phase were the same. The instructors had been trained to the same standards by the same training command. A pilot who completed the American training pipeline arrived at his operational unit with approximately 300 flight hours, including instrument time, night flying, formation flying, and gunnery practice. A navigator arrived knowing how to use every navigation instrument in the aircraft he would fly. A bombardier had dropped enough practice bombs to have a statistical confidence in his accuracy that was not theoretical but measured. The system produced 193,000 pilots during the war, 193,000, enough to crew every aircraft American factories could build and to replace the losses that the Luftwaffe inflicted and to have reserves remaining. The pipeline never ran dry. The formations over Germany never shrank because there were not enough men to fly them, they grew. This was the arithmetic that Galland had been warning about since 1943, and that no amount of German fighter pilot skill or German aircraft quality could ultimately overcome. Not because German pilots were inferior. The evidence of the air war does not support that conclusion. German pilots, particularly the experienced ones, were among the most capable combat aviators in history. But capability is not sufficient against arithmetic when arithmetic is sufficiently asymmetric. A superb pilot in an excellent aircraft who is killed once is gone. The American pipeline sent another one, and another, and another. The formations kept coming because the country behind them had decided they would keep coming, and had built the industrial and educational infrastructure to make that decision real regardless of what the Luftwaffe did to oppose it. Hans Berger survived the war. He was one of the fortunate ones, a phrase that requires some definition in the context of Luftwaffe fighter pilots defending the Reich in 1944 and 1945. Where fortunate meant alive and the baseline rate for the alternative was very high, he was shot down for a third time in March of 1944, this time by P-51 Mustang over central Germany, and sustained burns to his hands that removed him from operational flying for 4 months. He returned to his unit in July of 1944 and flew until the end of the war, finishing with 31 confirmed aerial victories and the Knight's Cross. After the war he worked as an aeronautical engineer at a state German aircraft components manufacturer, and later consulted for the nascent Lufthansa on technical specifications or the airline's post-war fleet. He gave the interview to the United States Air Force Historical Research Agency in 1952 in which he described his examination of the B-17 as a re-education. And in that interview, he spoke at length about what the aircraft had taught him. He said that the lesson had not been about American engineering superiority in any simple sense. He said that German engineers were as good as any in the world and that the aircraft they produced demonstrated that. He said the lesson had been about something underneath engineering, about the questions that were asked before the engineering began. He said that German aircraft design asked how do we build the best aircraft. He said American aircraft design asked how do we build the best aircraft for the man who will fly it into the worst situation we can imagine. He said those were not the same question. He said the difference between them was visible in every system of that B-17, and that once he had seen it he could not unsee it, and that he had spent the rest of the war flying against aircraft built from that second question and understanding, in a way he could not communicate to anyone who had not stood in that wheat field with him, exactly what it meant. He died in Munich in 1979 at the age of 67. Egon Mayer, who had read Berger's report and forwarded it to Galland with his own covering note, did not survive the war. He was killed on March 2, 1944, near Monody in northern France, shot down by a P-47 Thunderbolt during a combat engagement that lasted less than 2 minutes. He was 27 years old. He had 100 aerial victories. He left behind a wife and a young daughter, and a covering note in a file in Galland's office that had not produced the decisions he had hoped it would. Produced. The head-on attack tactic he had developed was still being used by Luftwaffe pilots defending the Reich on the day the war ended. It was one of the few tactics that remained viable against the American bomber formations until the very last days of the campaign. It was also, by that point, being executed by pilots with a fraction of Mayer's experience against bombers escorted by fighters that had no equivalent among German aircraft. The tactic survived its inventor by 14 months. The men using it at the end did not have his skill. They had his instructions and his courage, and they died at rates that he would have recognized as unsustainable. From the first week of his command, Adolf Galland was relieved of his command as general of the fighter arm in January of 1945, partly as a result of his persistent advocacy for the Me, the 160 jet fighter, and his increasingly direct criticism of Göring's leadership of the Luftwaffe. He was given command of a special jet fighter unit, JV-44, composed of some of the highest-scoring surviving aces in the Luftwaffe, and flew combat missions in the Me to 160 until he was wounded in April of 1945. 3 weeks before the war ended, he was captured by American forces, treated for his wounds in an American military hospital, and released in 1947. He wrote his memoirs, published in 1953 under the title The First and the Last, which became one of the most widely read accounts of the air war from the German perspective. He lived until 1996, dying at the age of 83, the last of the great Luftwaffe commanders of the Second World War. In his memoirs and in the many interviews he gave over the decades, he returned repeatedly to the question of what had decided the air war over Germany. He gave many answers at different times: resources, strategy, the Mustang, Göring's incompetence, Hitler's interference. All of these were true. None of them was complete. The complete answer was the one that Berger had begun to find in a wheat field in Bavaria in October 1943, and that Galland had read in a report and filed away, because acting on it would have required a different war fought by a different country with different assumptions about what its soldiers and pilots and aircrews were worth. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress flew to 191,508 sorties over Europe during the Second World War. It dropped 640,000 tons of bombs. It sustained losses of 4,735 aircraft in combat, with thousands more lost to accidents and mechanical failure. Of the approximately 100,000 American airmen who flew in B-17s over Europe, roughly 26,000 were killed and 28,000 were taken prisoner. Those numbers are not small. The 8th Air Force's bombing campaign was the most costly American military operation of the European War in terms of aircrew casualties, more costly per capita than infantry service in most theaters. The men who flew those missions knew what the odds were. They knew that a tour of 25 missions, later extended to 35, carried a statistical probability of death or capture that any honest calculation produced in uncomfortable quantities. They flew anyway. They flew because they had been trained to fly and equipped to fly, and because the country behind them had built aircraft that gave them a fighting chance of surviving. What the country why was asking them to do. The flexible wire insulation that stayed pliable at -40, the redundant oxygen bottles distributed through the airframe, the fused electrical branches that contained failures, the armored glass in the windscreen, the protected conduit routing round the primary wiring runs. None of these things made the aircraft invulnerable. The 4,735 B-17s that did not come home proved that, but each of them, in the specific situation it was designed for, kept an aircraft flying that would otherwise have gone down. And each aircraft that kept flying was 10 men who had a chance to get home. 26,000 did not get home. 74,000 did. The ratio is not a triumph. It is not a statistic to be celebrated. It is the record of what happens when a country decides that the men it sends into the worst airspace in the world deserve the best machine at the best engineers and build for the worst conditions those men will actually face. Hans Berger understood that in a wheat field in Bavaria in October 1943. He understood it not as a statement about national character or industrial capacity or any of the large abstractions that histories of the air war tend to reach for. He understood it as an engineer standing inside a broken machine, tracing the decisions that had been made before the first rivet was driven, feeling in the wire insulation and the oxygen outlets and the fused circuits the presence of people he would never meet who had asked the right question before the building began. The right question was not how do we build the best bomber. The right question was what does the man inside it need to come home, and the answer to that question, multiplied across 12,731 B-17s produced during the war, sent 74,000 American airmen back across the channel who would otherwise have stayed in the fields and forests of Germany alongside the 26,000 who did not make it. That is what left German pilots speechless when they examined a downed American bomber, not the aircraft. The answer to the question inside it. Thank you for watching this story all the way through. If it gave you something worth keeping, a detail about the oxygen system, a name you had not heard before, a way of understanding what those men flew into and why some of them came back. A light costs you nothing and means more than you might think. It tells the people who decide what gets seen at this kind of careful, documented history as an audience that wants it. If you are not subscribed yet, I would be honored to have you here. Hit subscribe and the bell so you do not miss the next story. There are more like this one waiting. I want to know where you are watching from today. Leave it in the comments, and if someone in your family flew in the Second World War in any aircraft, on any side, tell me about them. These stories belong to the people who lived them first. I would be honored to hear about yours.